Is this okay? Yes. Here we go. Good. Thank you, Linda, for playing one of my favorite songs. Be not afraid. I go before you always. Come, follow me, and I will give you rest. The Bible says, do not be afraid 365 times. That's enough to remind us every day that God is with us. Fear only robs us of our strength. From Deuteronomy 31, verse 6, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you or forsake you. In Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Let us pray. Oh God, each one of us has been through so much this past year and a half. Some of us have cared for those who have been sick. Some of us have gone to work and faced hardship and uncertainty. Some of us have learned to work from home. Some of us have helped care for children who couldn't go to school. Some of us have lost people we loved. Some of us have felt alone and overwhelmed. All of us have wondered when the pandemic will end. But God, you have been with us every single day. You have reached out to comfort us and give us strength. You have sent people to help us with our challenges. You have inspired treatments and vaccines to protect us. You have told us, be not afraid. Now we ask you to be with our community. Bring us together to heal. Remind us that we need each other. Help us to be an instrument of your peace. Amen. Well, I am so fortunate to count Lori Walsh as a friend. We have grown even closer as members of Pat Hammond's praxis group. We've been prayer partners who have shared our deepest needs. And we've also shared a glass of wine and laughed out loud. Lori does a wonderful job for South Dakota Public Broadcasting, hosting the show In the Moment. Her conversations are thoughtful, insightful, and bring out what the guests have to share. But often, she is the voice speaking truth to power, asking hard questions that people in power try to avoid. One morning, the praxis group received a text saying she was nervous heading into an interview on the show. Would we pray for her so that she could find the right words and the courage to ask the right questions? We let her know she was not alone. When we gathered last week at this class, Lori asked the social workers about their strategies for coping and relieving stress. She was particularly vulnerable. As she moved her broadcast booth to her home, that meant it was very much harder to leave things at work and separate when it was time to relax. Her much-loved brother died of cancer early on in the pandemic. Her daughter Jane had to leave college and move back home. And just when they adopted a dog, Lori fell on the ice and broke her foot. We are glad to have her here, still standing, sharing thoughts about what she witnessed during the pandemic, both professionally and personally. Please welcome Lori Walsh.
Thank you, Jean. And thank you all for staying and coming back after such a beautiful and inspiring morning. I have gathered some audio for you so you can listen to some of the conversations, the very difficult conversations we were having on this show. And we're talking about community today and food scarcity and evictions. I could throw a bunch of facts and data in front of you, but I think instead we will tell you a story. But I promise that when we get to the end, you'll be thinking, well, I can't promise what you're going to think. I promise that I will come back to that as a concept. This is not just about how the pandemic unfolded, but I think it's easy sometimes to forget the context in which hunger was happening, the context in which job loss was happening, the context in which Thanksgiving dinner was happening. So Jeff, if you just hit the right arrow, it will go to the first slide, hopefully. And I know that's small, so these are kind of almost my notes a little bit, but if you can read them, you can read them along. I'll tell you a little bit about the audio you're going to hear. You'll listen to it, and then I'll recap it in case you can't hear everything. So the first thing we're going to listen to is, so my daughter was in New York City at college when the pandemic began. So she came back from Christmas break, and there were kids from Wuhan who had come back to Columbia University. So I was particularly tuned in at the time those students came back and were isolated and tested. So we were paying attention to this very early. So was the South Dakota Department of Health. They were talking about this very, very early. So I don't think there's a context in which we can say anyone was surprised that this came to us, although I think there were some ways that it came to us that we were surprised. We had some advantages going in. We had a strong healthcare system, Sanford, Avera, Monument Health. The infrastructure for rural healthcare, though deeply imperfect, it wasn't like nobody had thought of this before. So there were a lot of people who had plans for how they were going to move forward. There were pandemic plans at the Department of Health. There were pandemic plans, at least that we were told, okay? So if you're in the facility, you might say, no, Lord, there wasn't a plan. But certainly the leaders and officials were telling us that they had a plan, and I felt confident that it was going to be tested, but they weren't necessarily surprised. We had strong healthcare infrastructure. We had low population density. So we were not New York. We were spread out, and we felt at the time that that was going to be a huge advantage for us. And the third thing was that we had time to prepare. So it felt like, in the spite of everything that felt chaotic, we could watch what was happening in Detroit, in Kansas City, in New York City, in Washington State, in their nursing homes, and we could learn very, very quickly. This also gave us time as journalists to prepare what our contingency plan was. Our leadership team was so brilliant. We had phased plans right away because we have stations or studios throughout the state. So the situation in Rapid City was very different than the situation in Sioux Falls. They had a little more time to prepare than we did in Sioux Falls. So based on county and community spread, we had phase action steps. So the first thing we did is we separated within our offices. I had a little glass booth. I almost caused myself to pass out through like hand sanitizer and cleaning. And I was like, oh, you need to clean a little less. We were doing that. And then there was a phase, like once we reached significant community spread or a certain number, then we would de-densify our offices and we would send people home. And the engineers ordered equipment, taught us how to use it. No engineer ever came inside my house, so I sent up I couldn't even set up I still have cable because I can't figure out like how to do anything else. But I can set up a home, studio now. And frankly, in the Marine Corps, we were out by the DMZ making radio antennas out of, whatever we had in hand. So it was familiar territory to me to kind of figure out how equipment works. What you're going to hear is November in 2020, right around Thanksgiving time, the BBC, the whole world is wondering what the heck is happening in South Dakota at this point, which you will hear explained in case you forgot. But we were, Rolling Stone was coming to town, Washington Post was coming to town, the New York Times was coming to town, CNN was coming to town, all these outside national and international journalists were reporting from South Dakota. Go back and see how many times they tried to explain the wind. It's my personal delight. Like, they can't lay off of it. They can't lay off a rusty pickup truck and the wind. And that's how you know they're not from around here. So they asked me, there was a show in the BBC, a morning show, and they contacted our organization and said, can someone do a feature that is called a reporter's notebook? Walk us through how you got here. They had a very low opinion of Governor Kristi Noem at that point from their perspective. And so I was in a position where I had to explain like how this began and how we got to where we were. So if Jeff can click on that audio, it's about 5 minutes. This is the reporter's notebook that was broadcast on the BBC from me in November 2020. doesn't work, that's okay, but I'm not hearing it yet. So in the upper left-hand corner of the slide, way up left, there is an audio icon. Yep, if you click on it, it will like create a box that then it will say play. And it's probably hard to see it. Wish I could bring that mouse down here. So the problem is from up there, they can't see it on their screen. So they're looking at this screen and trying to hit that little icon with that little arrow. It's proving to be an unexpected challenge. We'll try it for just another couple minutes. If not, I'll give you a recap. I was on BBC, yeah. Basically, if you remember, I'll let them kind of tinker with it, but walk you through February of 2020. The schools were closed for 2 weeks by Governor Kristi Noem for cleaning. Those students would never come back to class in the building, but then school would go home. March Madness, basketball, that was the basketball tournaments, state championships. SDPB was covering those state championships. Those were shut down in the middle of the state championships. Students went home. Some were not able to end up playing in their senior year of high school. The beginning, Governor Noem and Kim Mulsum-Reisen, the Secretary
When New
of the
York City
Department-
hospitals were overwhelmed by the devastation of a novel coronavirus in early 2020, South Dakotans watched from more than 2,000 kilometers away. By March, we were interviewing South Dakota nursing home administrators about their plans to restrict access to residents. South Dakota's Governor, Kristi Noem, held daily press conferences alongside the Secretary of the Department of Health. The state's three major healthcare systems, usually fierce competitors, worked together on plans to expand capacity and secure protective equipment for healthcare workers. South Dakota community leaders joined us on the radio to talk about our sparse population density and the strength of our personal responsibility. New York City is not South Dakota, they reminded us. Together, we learned how to de-densify our office buildings. With the help of creative engineers, we set up recording studios to broadcast from our homes. We supported our local restaurants by ordering plenty of takeout. We dashed outside into the blossoming of a South Dakota spring. Technically, South Dakota never shut down. Families taped paper hearts in windows to show love for healthcare workers. Church groups sewed cloth masks for first responders. But the churches themselves and the bars and the gyms across the state were never ordered to close by state government, although some of them were called on to make adjustments because of local restrictions. Others made adjustments on their own. Native American tribal communities were more assertive in their virus mitigation. Tribal leaders knew immediately how urgent the situation was, especially for their elders. They set up checkpoints at reservation entrances. Although Governor Kristi Noem demanded those checkpoints come down, she said they were illegal. The tribal leaders refused. In May, the governor issued a back-to-normal plan. Press briefings were no longer held daily. The governor appeared on national television frequently. She reminded the nation that South Dakota had taken a different path. She had trusted her people. She had preserved our freedom. In July, Governor Noem welcomed President Donald Trump along with thousands of unmasked enthusiasts to the Mount Rushmore National Memorial for an Independence Day fireworks celebration. In August, the South Dakota city of Sturgis welcomed hundreds of thousands of motorcycle aficionados for an annual rally. The mayor of Sturgis told us there was nothing the town could really do to keep people away, so they did their best to make things as safe as possible. The music and partying lasted long into the night. Soon, the COVID-19 infection rate, which had been low but never under any kind of certain control, began to climb. There is no evidence of a correlation between the large community events and the increase in cases, the State Department of Health told us. Governor Kristi Noem traveled the country. She campaigned for the re-election of President Donald Trump. Her personal campaign balance tripled in 5 months. She never shared a photo of herself wearing a mask during the spring or summer. Her public photos were often of her standing arm in arm with smiling supporters. South Dakota doctors told us again and again that widespread use of masks was essential to slowing the spread of the contagion. In the absence of a statewide mask mandate, municipalities tried to pass mandates on their own, but public meetings were often filled with shouting and accusations. "You're trying to kill my grandpa," one side would say. "You're trying to take away my freedom," the other would reply. People tried to work together, as South Dakotans are known to do, but people were divided all the same. By November, the South Dakota COVID-19 infection rate per capita had become one of the highest in the United States. Hospital ICU beds weren't quite full, but they were getting close, and hospitals implemented their surge plans. At the same time, President Donald Trump lost his bid for re-election, but South Dakotans lost hundreds of loved ones, grandparents, co-workers, parents, children. Often the obituaries you see in the newspapers don't say how they died. Meanwhile, a sprinkling of South Dakota cities have started passing mask mandates, mask education ordinances, and mask resolutions. National reporters have descended upon our towns and cities. They hold microphones in front of unmasked residents caught strolling out of crowded bars. They ask beleaguered local doctors and nurses to talk about their exhaustion and what it's like to watch so many patients die. They ask them if they are angry. And now, just as we've been celebrating the Thanksgiving holiday in the U.S., after days of record-setting new infections, South Dakota has reported an incremental downward trend in active cases, at least for a day or two. Governor Noem is encouraging people to continue to exercise personal responsibility and use good hygiene. There is no science to support claims that lockdowns stop the spread of the virus, she said in a press release that once again cast doubt on the usefulness of masks to slow the spread of COVID-19. A vaccine, Noem told me during a November appearance on our radio program, is set to be available to South Dakota healthcare workers and first responders within weeks. South Dakotans will decide for themselves, of course, whether or not they agree to take that vaccine.
That's a little bit of where we were at then. Clearly, I said hundreds of people had died. Very shortly in November and December, we would crest 1,000 people, and now we're more than 2,000 dead South Dakotans. We can go to the next slide. I did want to say one more thing about that, and that is we deal with facts. That's our entire job. Dealing with facts and emerging science is not new for us, so we felt uniquely prepared to deal with those facts and to sort out the rhetoric and the political rhetoric and the falsehoods and the truths and the, who's going to demonize our governor, who's going to celebrate her like she's a hero, cut through all that and try to get exactly to what we're doing. It's not easy to do, but that is what we were prepared to do from the beginning. The other thing was really hard for us to talk about is we saw the coverage in other places of suffering and how much do you put on the radio? I mean, just my voice telling you that story is powerful in a way without any images. How much are we going to put a microphone up to you while you cry because you lost your loved one? And so we were having some of those ethical conversations very early on. So what will that sound like? I can't speak to commercial broadcasting. I can't speak to print. This is the only newsroom I've ever worked in. I freelanced before, but I mostly did arts coverage. Public media is your media. That 90.9 in Sioux Falls, that's your station. It's your donations, it's your tax dollars, it's yours. And so I'm not saying anybody else is influenced by commercial interests, because I really don't know what happens in those newsrooms, but we are not. There is no political pressure on us. There is no, although we get political criticism, for sure, but there is no political pressure. I've never been told by anyone in state government that I cannot cover something. I've had my interviews criticized by state government. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, but I've never had anyone tell me you can't do this because you work for state government. And no commercial influence whatsoever. There are no sponsors that are going to cancel their, support of us if we tell you the wrong story. That's public media. So Act 1, this is this concept of generous authority. Priya Parker wrote a book called The Art of Gathering. I just really, really love her because she had been on the show before the pandemic, and I interviewed her right after Thanksgiving, or right before Thanksgiving, I think, about this idea of us all making these, like, how do we plan for Thanksgivings? How do we plan for gatherings? Because there were no rules per se, there were guidelines, but we weren't restricted in the same way that other states were. I'm not saying that's a good thing, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that's a thing. And so we all had to talk more. And if we can get to Priya's audio, and I think you can take the slide down just like you did before and just click on it, and we can hear, here we are talking a little bit about, and this is just about 2 minutes, what
in the Art of Gathering, I have a concept that I call generous authority. And generous authority basically means, well, let me step back for a second. So I define a gathering as any time 3 or more people come together for a purpose with a beginning, middle, or end. So a wedding, a funeral, a barbecue, a neighborhood barbecue, a Zoom meeting, a Zoom staff meeting, a family reunion. And one of the mistakes we make well before COVID in our gatherings is that we tend, particularly with our informal gatherings, to underhost. In part to not want to impose on each other, in part to not want to seem pushy. We tend to just kind of let people be. And part of the myth of the idea that we're leaving people alone is we're not actually leaving them alone. We're leaving them to each other, right? We're leaving our guests to deal with each other. And at some level, and I know different states have different governors and different restrictions, but one of the things that when governors are not sort of setting out specific restrictions, specific gathering guidelines, is that she's leaving you to each other, right? Meaning different people have different norms and perceptions of both the virus and how it spreads, but also perceptions of levels of risk. And so part of what families are dealing with all over the country, but particularly in states like South Dakota, I don't know if you know this, but I actually have a very deep connection to South Dakota. My grandmother's entire family is from South Dakota. My grandmother was born and raised in Wagner. Part of what the state is dealing with right now is that when a host in the form of a governor does not assert her authority to kind of create guidelines that protect the whole, the WHOLE, it leaves the guests, the citizens, to have to deal with each other. And particularly in families and friend groups that care about each other, part of that looks like much more explicit conversation than we normally would have to do something as simple as a play date.
She talks kind of quickly there, so I'll recap if you missed any of that. She defines a gathering as any time 3 or more people are gathered together for a purpose: a wedding, a funeral, a church service, an adult education, a family dinner, a play date. And when the event is under-hosted, that leaves guests to each other. And so when a governor says, I either choose or don't have the authority to do something, that leaves us to each other, and everything became a negotiation based on emerging science, personal preference and perceptions of the pandemic itself, what you were thinking about it, your politics, and your risk level. And that means that every date, every gathering, everything became a massive negotiation. Again, I'm not saying this is a good thing or the governor should have done, that is not my place to say. But when we talk about what happened in the community, that is exhausting. If you have to go somewhere and think, well, what's the speed limit going to be? I'm having the problem with masks now. I go out, like nobody's wearing a mask. I feel like, should I be wearing it? Should I not be? Masks are a perfect example. You all had to decide in some context or the other. We are not allowed as state government employees to mandate masks in our workplace. So now, at the stage we're on, we're all vaccinated. We shared that with each other voluntarily. And we talk to each other every day about how do you feel about masks? Where have you been? What are you doing? Where are you at? And we've become closer for that. But I've also lost relationships during the pandemic. There are relationships that I have, they're closer than ever, and there's some that I will probably never have again. Not because of masks, but because of other kinds of negotiations that I was not able to navigate. Let's go to the next slide, I think. This is what I'm calling Act 2. And you cannot separate the pandemic, in my mind, from the killing of George Floyd and the presidential election. These things are forever intertwined because of how they unfolded. So this, by the way, is a conversation. May 25th, George Floyd is killed in Minneapolis by Derek Chauvin. Chauvin was with the Minneapolis Police Department. Later, he's going to be convicted of second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. So I can say he murdered George Floyd now because he's been convicted. If you go back and listen to how we dealt with the conversation, we weren't saying he was murdered. We had to use different language because Derek Chauvin had not been convicted. Everybody is watching this tragic video. We are navigating this. My brother lives in Minneapolis. This is when he's about to die. So he has been declining quickly. He was already very, very sick. But the isolation of going to cancer treatment by himself, which many people have said, took a toll. My younger brother, who was by his side every second, couldn't be there anymore. None of us could do anything because we didn't want to get infected because we didn't want to infect Wes. So this is Tom Morozla. Sorry, I have to practice saying his name. He is an assistant professor of criminal justice at the University of South Dakota. He studies policing, and this is him really shortly after George Floyd is killed. And he talks about the police legitimacy crisis and the history of slave patrols and policing in the South, and how he'll say here that the issues are symptoms of a larger problem in the United States. Police are just kind of on the front stage right now. So if we can play Tom.
Yeah, I'm not really surprised at the recent events either. I think we're seeing just yet another police legitimacy crisis where they lose the trust of the public, and right now it seems like the trust of a lot of public. To put it into a little bit of historical context, which might help, is there's a strong case to be made that the first publicly funded police agencies in the United States were slave patrols in the South. And during that time, one of the biggest crimes one could commit is congregating and, planning an uprising or a rebellion. And these slave patrols were publicly funded, and they were quite harsh, and it resulted in a lot of loss of life. And then you saw police agencies pop up in the northern United States, and they were just sort of an extension of these mechanisms of social control. You saw the third degree, the police use of violence during these early times. Fast forward a little bit to 1943 when you had the Detroit, Michigan riots. Same year, the Robert Brandy was shot, which led to protests in Harlem, New York. You had Odessa Bradford in 1964, and in the 60s you saw just a police crisis across the United States during the civil rights movements that led to some change. But then fast forward a little bit more, and you have Michael Brown in 2014, Stephon Clark in 2019, Ahmaud Arbery, just recently Breonna Taylor, now George Floyd. All these instances are kind of leading to, yet another call for the police to become more accountable. And it's really the police misconduct and these issues are just sort of a symptom of a larger problem in the United States. The police are just kind of on the front stage right now.
So when we talk about how our community is doing, we talk about Native American checkpoints, elders in the reservation communities, our black and brown neighbors. I was married to a police officer, I think most of us know. Talking to Tom was the very first time I had ever heard that there were slave patrols in the South, and that was what some people perceive as the beginning of policing. I had to go check. I was like, what is he talking about? And so I had to learn a lot of history of why would he say that? Where is he coming from? It was such an egregious act that Derek Chauvin did, but a lot of people were not surprised by it. So this is how our community was also dealing with this idea that we were left to each other and that the things that we grew up with thinking were firm and solid were held together with duct tape and chewing gum. That's not my line. That's Jessica Bruder, who wrote Nomadland. She was also the person who received the first package from Edward Snowden. And she said when she found this whole thing unraveling as an investigative journalist, she thought, this is all held together by bubble gum and duct tape. What the heck? So we're going to pause from the audio and show you some images. I'm going to start at the upper right-hand corner there. I'm not sure how much you can see or how well you can see. That's the In the Moment team before the pandemic. Now, this is a strange picture, so I feel obligated to tell you that the man in black, this is our 666th show. And so he's a devout Lutheran, and his mother made us devil's food cake so we could ward off any sort of bad juju that would come to us during show 666. And so he is there making his devil horns. He's a deeply private person, so I won't tell you anything about how the pandemic is difficult for him. But the man next to him in the blue shirt with the glasses, leaning up against him, is Chris Lawfrey. And as I went home, Chris stayed in our studio because somebody has to run the board. And we never saw each other in person for almost a year. He cleaned more than I'm sure anyone in housekeeping cleaned. He put himself at risk every single day by going to work, and he had to work everything with engineering and with me and with the other producers and with the guests on the phone behind the scenes. So he is a true hero of journalism, even though you probably know his voice if you heard it, but you might not know his name. Next to him, standing behind me, is Josh Heyer, and he is our web producer. He's late 20s. I think he just turned 30. His girlfriend worked in a COVID unit as a nurse. And so I got to watch him figure out not only how to do his job from home with extreme circumstances, but how to figure out how to support someone that he loved. And when Wes died, he came to my house and with gifts from my staff, because I took some time off, and my staff, my coworkers, my colleagues, and he painted, he's just a brilliant artist, you guys, and he painted this just gorgeous original piece of art for me that I still have in my house. That's the kind of love that he put into taking care of me when I was down. He also wore a really cute pair of sweatpants shorts that my daughter appreciated very much because it had been a long time since she had seen anybody who was remotely her age. So we thank him for that as well. The woman standing next to me is Kara Hetland. She is the director of journalism content. So this woman has to hold down a very big fort in multiple places across the state. She is a stickler for the facts. She is a stickler for not being an advocate. If you sound like you're advocating for something, she will come to your house and make sure that that you do the right thing. And every reporter that fell apart and cried and needed time off and lost someone they loved, Kara was our mother. She also has 3 kids of her own. So a true Stephen Minister, not a surprise probably to many of you. Down to the bottom right, that's Jane from the hospital. When she was taken, she called me. She couldn't breathe. It's March 12th, I think. And I said, get your inhaler. She has asthma. Get your cell phone. Get your charger. Go downstairs. Tell the security guard, I have asthma. I cannot breathe. She did that. They whisked her off in a Columbia University ambulance. She was on the phone with me. So I was listening to the whole time, her not breathing. I called Pat at 2 o'clock in the morning, I think, and said, this is what's happening. And they didn't have room for her in the emergency room, so they put her in a pediatric room and kind of left her alone. At one point, she couldn't breathe, and she had to go out and say to them, like, I need help right now, so they would come in with her. She was very lucky that she got a COVID test. That's when they weren't very available. And then they locked her, sent her home, locked her down in a new dorm room. She had no fridge. She had to put all her stuff that she could carry into a bin by herself, walk it across the campus, stay in this room. The student health person, who was an epidemiologist, went to CVS and got asthma medicine for me personally, and picked up her prescription and brought it to her. And she was there for 6-7 days, because that's how long it was taking to get back a test. We didn't even know if she had COVID for 6 or 7 days. The picture at the bottom, you can see Mike Walsh and Jane sleeping in the car. Mike, superhero that he is, got in the car, drove to New York into the hot spot that it was, because that's the kind of thing that Mike Walsh does, and got a hotel room. I loaded every cleaning supply, because we couldn't get cleaning supplies then, right? So I loaded every cleaning supply that I had in his car, and so he could wipe off, I don't think he used any of them, but it made me feel better. And he went and he stayed in the hotel room indefinitely until she got a negative COVID test, which we still think was positive, but it was officially negative. And then meanwhile, students are sent home. And so all of Columbia University there are piles of stuff. They have to fly. International students who can't, it's just a hot mess. They're heroes to me too, the way those administrators worked things out. If you wanted money to store your things in New York, they gave it to you. If you needed money to get home, they gave it to you. They were just throwing resources at students to try to keep up with this whole process of getting the campus shifted to remote. I think their professors had 2 weeks to shift their classes to online. Mike will drive Jane home. She's very sick. Whether she had COVID or not, she was very, very sick. So there she is, kind of passed out in the car. Bottom left-hand corner that's the radio studio. It's also a theater, because Jane was in a theater class and was in a couple plays. So there's newspapers on the window there. There's a shower curtain hung on the wall. The lighting designer had to look through the Zoom screen and find out what kind of lighting. They mailed her lighting, they mailed her sound, they mailed her costuming, and the show went on. And so they did their shows right there. So the sheets they're covering, that's all my equipment that she's covering up. So I had all my radio equipment in the same room, cover it all up with sheets so the theater can't see them. Now it's a stage, and it really did some great stuff. Top left, that's my sister. She got married during the pandemic. I was not able to be there. She is holding a very large knife and has a maniacal look on her face. So we warned her husband. But we were all there. We were all there via Zoom, and my mother didn't get to go to her daughter's wedding. I didn't get to go to the wedding. We all dressed up and we danced, for a wedding dance, and sent video to her. And of course, the center picture is my family. We drove to Minneapolis. I didn't look up the date of this picture. My brother Wes is seated in that chair. That's the last time that we'll see him. We brought a tent and we slept outside, Jane and I did, so that we could not, afraid that we had COVID and we're going to expose him without knowing. It was the week before they were supposed to get married. So the man standing behind him in the tie-dye and the plaid, don't ask me to explain that. That's Kenny. And they had lived together and been a couple since Jane was born, I think, so almost 20 years at that point. And they decided to get married right before Wes was gone. So we went up one weekend. This is taken on a Sunday. I came back, I worked. He was going to get married the next Saturday. We had ordered flowers for our hair. He died on Thursday. So they did not make it to their wedding. But it just so happened, coincidentally, that when he died of a pulmonary embolism. When he got very sick and started coughing up blood, and they knew he needed to go to the hospital, the officiant for the wedding happened to be at their house. They were planning things. So they got married in the car on the way to the hospital, and then Kenny never saw him again. So I don't know what kind of wedding that was. I don't know what my brother was thinking at that time, if he even knew he was getting married, if he wanted to, I can't tell you, but I know that's what happened. So you can see in this picture, we're all kind of staggered. In the back, the single man alone is my brother Jeb, and then my sister Sarah and her daughter Phoebe, and then, of course, me and Jane in the front. And when I left his house that day, he wanted to give me a hug. And I was like, oh my gosh, do I do that or not? Like, I mean, I don't even know what to do. And I'm glad to say that I hugged him. And so I was able to make that decision and take that risk. And it's the last time I ever talked to him or hugged him. I think we texted. So, next slide. This is a recent interview. It's Terry Gross, who has been doing interviews for 45 years for a show called Fresh Air. I think a lot of you probably know who she is. She's very well known, and this is kind of in retrospect of looking back at what we have been through. And I asked her a little bit about whether she thinks this is different, because I mean, I've only been doing this for 6 years on public radio. I was reporting for 10 years before that, but this is new to me fairly. And she's been through the 1960s, she's been through all these things. So if you can hit play, I asked her, like, is this anything new to you? And here's what she said. Are we at a crisis point in a way? Are we at consecutive crisis points in a way that we were not before? I mean, you've been doing this for 45 years and still going strong. Does this time we're in feel different, or does it feel like a repeat of another time for you?
No, it feels different. When I started in radio, we wouldn't have people who were extremists, because why would you give a person who was like a neo-Nazi, a white nationalist, or somebody who was like so anti-abortion that they were willing to hurt people, to shoot people, to stand in the way of women getting abortions. And now all of that stuff has gone into the mainstream. It's represented in Congress. It's represented in state legislatures. It's in our laws. It's in the courts. And I find that level of extremism so alarming, not to mention things like, January 6th. I have never witnessed anything like that. I've never witnessed the level of misinformation and disinformation and out lying and deceit that we're seeing. And I find it very alarming. And it also, you could put as much fact and truth and serious analysis out there as you want, but if people refuse to listen, or if people refuse to believe it because they believe conspiracy theories instead, what do you do to counteract that? Like, how do you reach people who don't want to be reached? And I don't mean just that they don't want to listen to public radio. I mean, they don't want to hear what's true. They want to hear the conspiracies.
I'm really hoping you have an answer, because that's the question. Yeah. That's the big question, right?
Yeah.
Do you know?
Me, I don't have an answer. No.
Well,
and it's impacting our lives. It's impacting our health.
I'm sorry, Terry Gross does not know the answer. And neither do I. I know this. For us, our solution, our approach has been to stay as local as possible, to talk to local doctors, local lawmakers, local officials, local people, as much as humanly possible. Sometimes we go to the outside because there's something that people just can't say because they're from South Dakota, and we're like, we're going to have to call somebody else and get that perspective on the air. we relied on the facts, but because I'm not just a reporter, it's a talk show, I was able to and am able to give a lot of context. We talked to a lot of therapists on our show. We talked to a lot of counselors who would do not on-air counseling, and we didn't have people call in, but I asked them questions. I broke down and cried and said what. We talked to grief specialists. We tried to do something entirely different and bring on musicians so that we would give you some, poets and the arts and things that would make you feel like this is going to be okay. How do we opened up, we don't even have time to tell you what SDPB as an organization did for education with their television channels and opening up, statewide classrooms and things like that. I don't even understand how that works. It's shocking and wonderful. But when we talk about, yes, people did not have food. Yes, people were evicted. Yes, there are workforce shortages that are causing people like my sister to work so much that she's now has an injury and needs surgery because she walks, and never gets to stop walking because she works in a restaurant and they don't have any staff. There are real things falling apart, but as they fall apart in the context of people not trusting institutions anymore and people not knowing how to handle it. And every decision had a 24-hour expiration date. We would decide one thing, and the next day we'd have to decide something else because the facts changed. It's happening in this whole big conversation about systemic racism. It happened during a presidential election. It's happening during climate change. All these things, when we talk about, like, what are you doing in the community as a church, this happened to you. This happened to me. This happened to everyone that we deal with in the community. And every single person has a story. And so I hope, if nothing else, we can create a space. Oh, there's one more slide. There it is. This is what I wanted to end with because I've depressed the heck out of myself. Last night, I had my throat started closing up when I was listening to some of this audio, and I almost ditched the whole thing because I was like, if I can't handle it, how can people who are joining me today, how can I ask you to walk through this with me? But then I realized you've already walked through it without me. Like, I don't have to pretend that you didn't already know all this stuff. That's Jane today, looking fierce and fabulous. She is back in New York. That picture of a bunch of people you don't know is a picture of a bunch of people I don't know. They did an icebreaker kind of thing when they got together for, I'm not even sure what the event was. And their assignment was to arrange people in your group in a vignette that represented your family. So the student in the mask with the long hair who is putting her hands like this and smiling warmly, she is representing me and the kindness and love that I share. I will take it. The student standing next to her, I don't have to tell you that, is Mike Walsh. It's exactly how he stands, and he is representing the strength and the conviction that Mike Walsh has and the sheer toughness that he protects her in. The student crouching on the ground in the white sweater is representing our tortoise. She was told to just sit on the ground and look as vacant as possible and be a tortoise, and that is what she did. I think she crushed it. But I would like to say I kept a tortoise alive during all this, and that was not easy because they don't need a lot. And so days would go by, and I'd be like, oh my gosh, I didn't feed the tortoise. Still alive, I did not neglect the tortoise. And interestingly enough, the student in the purple sweater there is representing my younger brother. So Jane lost an uncle, and then she has another uncle. And when she had limited people, I don't know what was in her mind, she had this student stand here and she said, just look like you have beef with the whole world. And I told Jeb that, and he said, I'll take it. I see this, I don't know if she sees it like this, I see this as an expression of grief in our family, because my younger brother, probably more than anyone else, is who we look to be reminded of how much we've been hurt and are still hurting. So my question is, if someone has a vignette of your family, how are you represented? If you had a vignette of our church, how would you represent us? Because somebody else sees you from the outside, and when you're not around, is arranging little characters in their mind. And I'm very happy that she didn't have me with a microphone, being the journalist defender of the truth, or even speaking truth to power. She said, this is a compassionate, kind-hearted woman who gives me unconditional, unending love. That is how I would like to be seen. And to me, the fact that she sees that is enough. We've all been through so much. Everyone is transformed. Little kids are transformed by this. We get to decide how we're going to be transformed. And to me, those facts matter, but it's the conversations that create the culture. And the conversations that we have in this space. I would not have made it through this time, even though you never saw me, without this church, without tuning in, without the Praxis group, without the prayers of Jean Nicholson and Anya Hookman and Claire Gillespie and Kathy Newcomb and the people that I know and love who are here today, without tuning into Nathan's sermons, without the glorious, beautiful, I'm in love with Dan Graber, and everything that you do for him, I would not have made it. We would have not made it. So thank you. We're not done. There's a lot of unprocessed junk for us to go through. And we get to go through it together with Jesus. Jean, I think that's all I have to say.
Is this on again? Good. We knew that would be insightful, and you've given us a lot to think about. We do have next week Chris Graham coming, and she is a mental health professional, and it will be interesting to see what she says to us. And also, as we were talking about policing, we're working on getting our new chief of police here in January for a program. Jonathan Toome is the son of Dennis Toome, who has come to give us lots of lessons. So I know that will be good. Do we want to close with any questions for Lori? Any comments? Kind of hard to top what she said, but if anybody has anything to say, we certainly are open. Okay, thanks for coming. Think about it all, and please come back next week.
Thank you.